you stumbled upon this video, I would imagine it's the first week of December and your Oxford interview is just around the corner. ChatGPT tells me that the overall undergraduate offer rate hovers between 15 to 17% in recent years. However, the more competitive science and maths subjects fall well below this general figure and usually are estimated to be between or around 1 in 10 chances. So in other words, that's a 90% failure rate. And to be honest, it's pretty much what I experienced 20 years ago when I applied. It hasn't got any easier to get in. Competition for places is ferociously competitive, so you need to make sure you prepare as much as possible. I had my interview on the 12th of December 2000 and I applied for chemistry. I had 2 interviews at New College, which was my first choice college, and a 3rd interview at Worcester College, where I eventually ended up studying. So what I'm going to go through today is how to prepare for an Oxford interview, particularly if it's science or maths based, as that is my expertise, but also how to prepare for a humanities or arts based subject based on feedback I've had from many friends who have got in for subjects such as law, economics, history, PPE in particular, which is very popular. And they've been kind enough to give me their feedback for the questions they were asked, what they did to prepare. So we can compare then how a science interview, in the questions in that sort of process, what does it look like compared to a humanities or arts based subject. So that's what I'm going to begin with today. Chemistry. What did I do? How did I prepare for it? And what sort of questions come up? So typically what you can expect is for the questions to sort of increase in difficulty gradually throughout the course of your interview. They sort of scale from knowledge you've acquired in school right through to, they're going to push the boundaries, knowledge you're going to learn in sort of first year undergraduate. So my interview started with questions actually from content I'd learned in year 9 chemistry, which was very easy. And then by the time they got to the end of my interview, both the first, second and third, now looking back, the content at that point was first term, second term undergraduate. And I was being really stretched to my limit about what I could answer using knowledge that I've, learned at GCSE, high school level, as well as A-level chemistry. So what I think this comes down to is they use sort of a staircase approach where the first few questions are quite easy. It's just to sort of calm you down, lower your anxiety level, especially if you come in and you look nervous, which is what I did. And then once you settle, they'll start ramping up the difficulty bit by bit through the course of the interview until at the end, you're basically forced to ask for help or, for more information, which is what I did in fact, all 3 interviews. And what they're looking to do then is see how far they can push you before you tap out, if you like, and you think, okay, can I have some help? So let's take a look at the exact questions I was asked in my first interview, which was at New College. It was for organic chemistry, so it was with the organic chemistry tutors, using this animation I've just put together. And then we could discuss then what you can do to prepare based on what I had in my interviews. So this was my first question, and as you can see, a really nice introduction to the interview, a really nice starter. So what is a hydrocarbon and where do they come from? So I correctly stated that hydrocarbons are derived from fossil fuels. Primary fossil fuels we use are coal, oil and gas, and that fractional distillation is the process that we use to get various different length alkanes from crude oil, and then they are processed further for whatever uses are necessary. And then I think it was ethane or propane in both displayed and skeletal formula. So that was a really nice start, settled my nerves. And then we went on to the second question, where the difficulty sort of went up slightly then, looking at sort of year 12 A-level content, or if you're watching this from the US, it would be your organic module in the advanced placement course. And it was basically, can you draw and describe the bonding in ethene? And what they were looking for here was they able to talk about the sigma and pi bonding that takes place, particularly the overlap between the pz orbitals on each of the carbons, which I could do as I'd learned that content. And I did a decent dot and cross showing the orbitals overlapping between the carbons and the carbon and hydrogen bonds in ethene. And then this was the start of the sort of more difficult questioning, where it wasn't designed to catch me out, but it required that I know the knowledge. So it said, how does the electronic structure support ethene having 4 unpaired electrons? So if you look at the periodic table, obviously carbon is in group 4. And on a very simplistic GCSE electronic configuration, you would write carbon as 2, 4. But that's not the answer they were looking for. So you're required to obviously draw out the more detailed electronic configuration involving shells, subshells, and orbitals, and showing the electrons in boxes. So I went ahead and did that, which is 1s2, 2s2, 2p2, and then you put the electrons in the boxes, like I'm doing here. And you can clearly see from the 2p subshell, there's only 2 unpaired electrons. And that's what they pointed out. Yet carbon has 4 unpaired electrons when it bonds to, say, 4 hydrogens in methane, or in other sort of saturated molecules that carbon forms. And I thought, yeah, that stumped me for a little bit. But then I remembered that carbon has what is called basically a pre-bonding state, where an electron is transferred from the 2s subshell to the 2p subshell to create a new configuration, 2s1 and then 2p3, which then gives 4 unpaired electrons, and then explains why carbon is capable of forming 4 covalent bonds, or 2 double bonds and a single bond, or 1 triple bond and 1 single bond. So after a few moments of thought, I was able to get to that answer. And again, that was good. That gave me confidence, and I could see that they were happy with the answer that I'd given. Okay, and now on to the last set of questions, which were around isomerism, and a topic I'd not yet covered because it was from undergraduate chemistry. But obviously little did I know that until we actually got to that point in the interview. So the first portion was about butene, butene, and drawing the isomers. So that was pretty easy. So just went ahead and drew the E and Z isomer of butene, which is what I'm doing now. And they were pretty straightforward to do. I did both the skeletal form and the displayed form, and then I was asked to decide which of them has the lower in energy. And I sort of went with the Z isomer because the sort of methyl groups are closer to each other. But I couldn't give the nuanced, detailed argument to explain why that would cause a problem for the overall energy of the isomer. I just knew that from A level that is the lower energy isomer. That's as far as sort of my knowledge went. So the correct answer, but very simplistic, no explanation behind it. And then they threw in this question about butane. Can you draw butane? And does butane have any straight chain isomers? And at this point, I was stumped. So I went ahead and drew butane, which is as simple as that. And I was looking and thinking, do you mean a structural isomer, which is that one, methyl propane? And they said, no, straight chain. And then this came like the first sort of few minutes of silence where I was just thinking over and over. And I could feel my heart rate pick up a bit, but it was okay. I thought I'd done pretty well up to this point. So I was looking at my drawing and thinking, how can I make another isomer out of that? Does it even have isomers? And then they just gave me a little bit more rope to sort of answer this. They said, okay, consider the methyl groups at the end. Can they be drawn in another configuration? And I looked at my drawing and I thought, well, I got one going up and I got one going down, so maybe I could just do it the other way. Both of them going up or both of them going down. So I did this, and that's exactly what they were looking for. But again, I still didn't really know what I was doing at this point. So I had my 2 drawings, and these 2 things, they're not called isomers, they're called conformers. And butane has 2 of them. And at this point, they introduced these 3-dimensional like plastic models onto the table we were working at for me to look at. And then they just said, can you manipulate the model to make each of those forms of butane. They'd not mentioned the word conformer yet, by the way. They didn't mention it at all. This was something I learned at undergraduate level once I was already in. So then I manipulated these models, and I was able to correctly deduce that this one I'm circling in red was the higher energy one, because when I had the model in my hand, the methyl groups on the end, so if I just draw it with the methyl group shown, similar to butene, the Z form of butene, you could see that the methyl groups were physically closer to each other. And I thought, and I used the words, well, they're going to sort of clash with each other. They're going to bang into each other. And on a simplistic level, that was the correct answer. And they nodded, and I could see they were quietly impressed that I'd got to that and deduced that they were sort of in the way. And then I thought, and then they asked, well, okay, so why is that a problem? And I said, well, there would be electrons around each of those carbons, and then that would be electron-electron repulsion, sort of like instantaneous repulsion. And that, again, that was correct, and they really liked that answer. This topic is actually part of something called sterics, which you do a lot of in organic chemistry, and that's what this question was around, which is something you don't do at A-level whatsoever. But I was able to come up with a very basic answer to their question, which was correct. After I'd looked at the models and I deduced that this one was less stable than this one, at the end they sort of plugged the gaps in with the extra knowledge in terms of electron repulsion, what's called steric hindrance, and these sorts of points, which I would then later learn at undergraduate chemistry. So the point I'm making here is that I was able to use the new information they'd given me, formulate an argument or a reasoning for why one drawing of butane would be higher in energy than the other one, even though I wasn't using the correct scientific terminology, and even though I didn't know the content, I could sort of see the correct answer and just explain it in my own words. And that's all they were looking for, the potential to answer something unfamiliar, given new information, and just basing it off knowledge I already had, and then pushing me that little bit further. And I was able to demonstrate this on the day. And that, everyone, is exactly what they're looking for. Can you take new information with something completely unfamiliar to you and give it a good go and come up with some sort of answer, some sort of explanation to their question, which doesn't have to be perfect, but has got sound reasoning and conviction behind it? And if you can, that is what's going to make a successful interview for you. So can you see what they did there? They started off with something very easy. Fossil fuels. You learn that in year 9 geography and chemistry. What's a fossil fuel? Coal, oil, gas. Do you know they're made up of hydrocarbons? And then suddenly taking a hydrocarbon you learn in basic organic chemistry, and then building a set of questions around that, gradually getting harder and harder until at the end it was quite challenging because it was content I just hadn't learned or didn't know. But I could apply the knowledge that I had from A level and sort of stretch it as far as I could before I needed help. So now that I've explained this process, what should you do to prepare for your interview if it's science or maths based? Well, what I'm going to go through next is what I did in the lead up to the interview itself, so 2 to 3 weeks out. And then also the preparation I did between interviews whilst I was on site waiting between my first and my second, and my second and my third. What I noticed is a lot of the potential candidates there, they were just in the common room, wasting time, not doing any prep. I just couldn't understand it. I was thinking something this serious, this important, and you're not doing any preparation in between. It's just don't do that. Because funnily enough, the first couple of questions, which were on organic chemistry and then later progressed to harder content, sort of midway through my first interview, I'd actually revised a couple of days before I came up for interview, and I thought, I'm so glad I looked over that. And then the same goes for some of the content in the second interview, and then finally the third interview with Worcester College. Again, it was all sort of notes I was looking at in between the interviews. In the room they'd assign me at New College, and it's just studying and revising as normal as if you were at school. I think it's really important you do that and you don't waste the time just sitting around waiting for the interview, because if you go in and then you get a question and you think, oh, I could have answered that if I just revised, we're not going to forgive yourself. So just prepare as much as possible. So this is what I did. First things first, make sure you know all of your year 12 content as much as possible. Or if you're in the US, your advanced placement content, because you will be asked questions on topics that you've already covered. Now, you don't have to know it in, incredible amounts of detail, but you do need to have a really good, well-rounded understanding of the topics you've covered so far. So in the case of chemistry, you would have done all of the year 12 content on alkanes, alkenes, the mechanisms, as well as like molar calculations. Perhaps you might have done equilibrium and rates of reaction. So just know these topics well. And then I practice some past paper questions on each of those topics, maybe 1 or 2 questions per topic. And I just try to revise as much as possible. Then once I'd done that, I went on to the year 13 content I'd studied so far. So in the case of an Oxford interview, we know it's in December. So that's everything I'd learned from September to December. And that was actually quite easy because it was still fresh in my head. And I didn't need to, go back 12 months into my notes. So when I got up to Oxford, that's when I found out who my interviewers were in terms of the organic team in the first interview, then the physical and inorganic tutor in the second, and then finally for Worcester, it was all 3 tutors, organic, physical, and inorganic. And I looked up their research interests and their specialisms, any books they had published, research papers, etc., so that I could brace myself for potentially questions around, their specialism, their topic area. So, for example, in the second interview, that's exactly what happened. The interviewer was working on sort of quantum chemistry, quantum physics stuff regarding electronic transitions in atoms and colours. And that's what my interview started with, those sorts of questions. I was sort of bracing myself for, a physical style interview around, like quantum physics. And that's exactly what happened. So make sure you read up your interviewers. Right, the other thing is I did some research and I read a lot of news, magazines, what was going on in the media, anything on the internet that was happening around my subject. Keep an eye on any, lecturers you might be following, scientists in the media, popular magazines, anything. There's so much media out there now that you can consume and write down an interesting article so that if a question comes up about, tell me something you've read in the media, tell me something that's captured your attention, that's excited you, you've got a set piece to talk about. And then that makes you look well read, it makes you look engaged and genuinely enthusiastic for your subject. Otherwise, if you haven't done any of that sort of reading, well, it's not going to look good and it's going to really unsettle you, and then it could affect the rest of your performance in the interview. Plus, it's not going to be very impressive to them that you're not really interested in the subject. You're just trying to get into the university. Right, another thing I did was I asked other successful candidates who had got into Oxford, not just Worcester, a new college, but other colleges as well, for other subjects. Had interviews with them and talks with them at my sixth form college where I was studying my A-levels. As well as I knew some friends who knew, people who were in the second year and third year and were happy to give me some advice. Now, at the time, YouTube wasn't about, but now there is so much content out there that you can look up on YouTube and other platforms, social media, whether it be Facebook, TikTok, anything that you can get some feedback from people who have been successful getting into Oxford and I'd say Cambridge as well, because it's pretty much the same process. Then you can write down and use to your advantage. So now more than ever in this age of information, there is so much out there that you could use to help you prepare for this interview. Finally, as I said previously in this episode today, make sure you are revising and preparing between each interview, because when I came out of the first interview, which was the organic, I sort of had ideas for physical and inorganic content that I thought, oh, right, I need to brush up on X, or I need to look over Y, or maybe practice a question on Z, just because of the way the interviewers made me think about questions, the depth they went to, the difficulty. And I just thought, right, I really need to pick my game up, I need to do more work in the other areas before my next interviews, just in case something comes up that's difficult and I'm not caught short. So it's like sort of after that first interview, it's like inspiration then, if you like, to look up things, because you'll have a feel for the difficulty, because the second and third are going to probably be quite similar. They won't be drastically different. They're still going to be really hard. But you get that feel for the style of interview, the intensity of it, the pace, and you think, right, okay, I better read up on this content I've not been tested on yet, just in case it comes up. Next up, let's take a look at a non-science or maths based subject. So one of my good friends has been kind enough to provide detailed feedback on his experience for PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. And just from experience, it's such a popular subject, so hard to get in for. So he did really well. So we got to look at the interview process for his journey into Worcester College, and then we can compare then of how it's different to a science or maths based interview, but also see if we can pick out any similarities which are going to be the same regardless of what subject you apply for. So the first set of questions were based on an essay he had to submit to the tutors in advance, which would then form the basis of the discussion for the remainder of the interview, and also be a springboard into other topics. So as you can see from the first question, his particular essay was on renationalising the railways. So in his essay, he laid out the relevant arguments for and against renationalising the railways, and then the tutors would interject with their own knowledge and their own facts, which would then challenge his viewpoint, and he'd be asked to comment on it and asked whether that has changed his mind, why it might have changed his mind, and then also if that triggered sort of any other viewpoints that he had not considered before. So that was the opener he described to me. So I would imagine that if you have produced a good, captivating, interesting essay, then it's going to create a lot of questions, a lot of interest from the tutors, which you can then confidently talk about, providing that you know the content and you've understood what you've written. Then the second question he sort of described as sort of standard verbal reasoning, where he was given some information about what person A had said about a topic, and then another person interjecting person B, offering an alternative opinion, and then just asked to comment on what he thought about that discourse between the two. Did he agree with A? Did he agree with B? Or did he agree with both? And he just explained that the tutors were looking for, could he see both sides of an argument without sort of committing to one side too early, sort of considering the pros and cons of each, if you like. Then question 3, this was topic based. He didn't mention what particular topic it was that he'd forgotten, but he did make a point about the tutors across both interviews being very interested in his viewpoints on whatever the topic of the day was. So they would ask him a question about a specific topic. He would offer his opinion, which may include just an opinion, but also might be based on some facts that he knew. Then the tutor would offer some additional information, some additional facts. And again, it was to see, whether that would change his mind or sort of revisit his initial thinking, and has it changed it in any way? So that's why you can see what assumptions have you made in formulating your argument? What arguments best support this position and why? So where have you got this information from? Why have you come to this conclusion? And then interestingly, what might someone else think who have come from a completely different starting point, as in background, upbringing, just a completely whole new worldly viewpoint compared to yourself. I can imagine probably at this point he was being really stretched, because you'd have to sort of empathize with somebody in a completely different position to himself, put himself in that person's shoes and how they would think about that particular topic or idea. I'm from a science background, but even I could see that would be quite difficult, trying to empathize with somebody you have no experience being, or you haven't lived a day in their life, and how they might have a completely different viewpoint to you. So I can see that being quite tricky. And then finally then, this is more general to sort of both the first and second interview. He did mention that he was constantly challenged on any assumptions or viewpoints that he held. And as you can see from the very first part of this topic here, insert alternative piece of knowledge / facts from tutor that challenge your assumptions. So you would say something, the tutor would come back at you with a piece of knowledge that directly challenges your initial thoughts or some new evidence, some recent developments, etc. And then you think, okay, perhaps I need to rethink this. Is there an alternative way of thinking about it? Why has this changed my mind? Why was I so set in my ways thinking about X now that Y has happened? And how will this change my view going forward? So what they were looking for there, he described, is, could you see sort of both sides of an argument or more than one side, and then talk through your reasoning, your thought process behind those changes in thought you might have had. So as a sort of general point before we move on, he did mention that they were looking for you to be sort of well-read and worldly and just have, an opinion on general topics and affairs and be able to formulate an argument for, say, a particular topic and come up with arguments on one side of the fence and then the other, but without really committing to one side. So say 3 arguments for something, then 3 arguments against, and then come into some sort of conclusion. So if you go back to the initial opener, should the railways be renationalised? So coming up with maybe 3 good reasons why that's a good idea, and then another 3 why it's not so good, and then come into some sort of conclusion at the end, which is quite grey, but you're not overly committing to one viewpoint or one side. What you're demonstrating is an ability to think about all points of view in an intelligent, complex way to show that you've thought about it deeply, and then just comment on it, just give your opinion on it. And the more detailed, the more nuanced, and the more thorough you are with that is what they consider impressive. So clearly, as you can see, a completely different style of question compared to science or maths. Not a sort of linear progression of knowledge where you're tested on absolute facts and knowledge. Rather, you are asked to think about topics or ideas, formulate, a complex argument with arguments for and against, and then come to some sort of conclusion at the end. Whereas, like, for example, with a maths interview, you might be given an algebraic problem to solve, and there's a right or wrong answer. Or, say, chemistry, maybe you're asked to recall a flame test, say sodium, which is yellow. Again, it's absolute. There's a right answer, the wrong answer, and that's it. Whereas there's sort of humanities subjects, and particularly the questions he was asked at his PPE interview, you can see they're just so different. But the one thing we did agree on, which I thought was interesting, is both our interviews started with relatively easy questions to sort of settle our nerves, ease us into the process, and then gradually that difficulty was ramped up over the course of the interview. So it was interesting to hear that, because we both felt the same way, even though we went for obviously completely different subjects. Finally then, let's finish with some general points about the interview process and some other things you could be asked that are not necessarily subject specific. And these questions could come at the beginning of the interview or at the end, and that's exactly what I experienced in the first interview and the second interview. So in the second interview, when I sat down in front of the 2 physical and inorganic chemistry tutors, rather than going straight into questions, which is what happened in my first interview, it must have been like 30 seconds and there's your question, go, tell me what you know. The second interview started with more of a general discussion about chemistry, and the very first question I was asked was, tell me something you have read in the media recently. And I thought to myself, yes. On the train on the way up to the interview, I had read that week's copy of New Scientist, and there was an article in there on quantum physics and structure of the atom, emission spectra, so how elements produce different colours of light when they undergo like excitation and that sort of thing. And I just started talking about that. And just pure luck, he had read that article as well. And the reason why is because his area of expertise, his research, was based around like sort of quantum chemistry, quantum physics, and just the physical aspects of, emission spectra, that sort of stuff. So that's why he'd read it. And I remember thinking, okay, I can sort of answer this opening question, and then what that was the springboard then into harder questions for the rest of the interview. And then when I got out to the end of the interview, I thought to myself, imagine if I'd not read anything. If I'd not read, say, the BMJ, if I was applying for med school, New Scientist, for any science, I'd not been reading any newspapers, I'd not read any magazines, anything at all around science, and I just said nothing. It would have been a disaster. It would have made me so nervous, so, unprepared, if you like. And then that could have snowballed into, a really, really bad interview. And then I wouldn't have done myself justice. But the very fact that I'd read something and I could just reply to his question with a basic understanding of the article that I'd read, it completely settled my nerves. I could feel my heart rate. It dropped down and it just settled me. And then he gave me some paper. He gave me my first question, which was about the emission spectra of hydrogen, just talking about electronic transitions and the colours produced, which was quite straightforward. And then it got harder and harder, but it was okay, because even though the questions started getting harder from that point, I had already had that little bit of confidence, that little bit of self-belief, because the interview opened so well. So my point is, make sure you are reading something around your subject prior to the interview. Maybe a week or two out, read journals, blog posts, anything you follow on the internet that is around your subject, that is interesting, or they could potentially ask about, so that you're prepared if you get that unexpected question. Tell me about something to do with your subject that isn't content based, that isn't based on the syllabus that you're following in school, so that it looks as if you're a well-rounded individual, if you like. So that was the second interview. And I remember the first interview, I had one of those general questions right at the end. So I'd finished the sort of technical questions that they'd given me, and what the head organic tutor just squeezed in for the last couple of minutes, just some general talk about why am I interested in the subject, where's this interest come from, which kind of caught me off guard, because at that point I was expecting the interview to finish. We'd already gone over time slightly, so they just held me there for like another 30 to 90 seconds, I think it was, just speaking about general points. Why do I like the subject? Why have I picked it? What do I see myself doing down the line? Just stuff like that. So it's always worth preparing for those sorts of questions, as well as the content-based ones, which are going to form the bulk of the interview. In terms of the third interview, I'm asked about this all of the time. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that you've been called for a third interview? The answer is yes, absolutely. Because what that shows is, if you've had sort of two interviews and maybe one has gone okay and then the other one has gone really well, which is what happened to me, and they're on the fence about you, and perhaps they don't have enough spaces for you at the college you've applied for, then they will look and ask other colleges if there's space available for you to study your subject, and then you'll be called for an interview with that college. How do I know this? Because that's exactly what happened to me. And I found out this once I was in the university, once I was in my third or fourth year, and I was just out for a drink with my organic tutor when I was researching for my masters, and they just become your friends. And I asked them, what happens during that interview process if there isn't a space? he explained, yeah, this is what happens if we like you and you've shown potential in the interview, we will try and find another place for you at another college. So getting that notification after the second interview, I think it was a few hours after I finished at 2, and then I was told by the end of the day, before I was about to go home, that I was going to be called for another interview. That, please, can you stay another day? You've been called for another interview. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I just thought, okay, great, another chance to show what I know. But looking at knowing the bigger picture now and knowing what really goes on, that's really good news, because you've got another opportunity to do well. And then if you smash that interview, then that's going to improve your chances. But I will say this, if you only have 2 interviews, that's not a bad thing. That means if you get a place, that means you've done really well to get in just off the back of 2 interviews. In fact, my friend who did PPE, he later found out once he got in that it was his first interview that went really, really well. The second one, he said he struggled a lot with some of the questions, but they'd already made their mind up off the basis of the first interview. So if you do go for an interview and you only have 2, don't feel disheartened if you don't get that third, because you may have done enough to get your place just off the 2 interviews. So I hope today's episode was useful and you can put the information into good use. And by the way, the advice I've given today applies whether you're doing the interview in person or indeed online on Zoom, which has become increasingly popular with some colleges. It's exactly the same. Study hard for your interview. Make sure you know the content that you've learned from year 12 and so far in year 13. And if you don't know something outright, don't be afraid to say, I'm not covered this topic, I don't know anything about that, because they will quickly move on to something that you do. And that is reassuring, because you don't have to know everything. Other than that, that's it. Good luck. I hope it goes well.